now, basically providing a safe space for people to think about issues beyond what you might find, dealing with the day-to-day life of numbers in our workplaces and the other day-to-day challenges. So it's really great to have Adjunct Professor Anthony Asher here with us this afternoon. Anthony, thanks very much for joining us. I think many of you will have met Anthony. Many of you will have studied under him over the years at UNSW. And of course, he's had an extensive career in the finance industry as a consultant as well, worked for APRA and also taught at 2 universities, both here and also in South Africa. So something like 25 years of university teaching experience, which is pretty amazing. Well, I got that on your LinkedIn profile, so I'm hoping that was close. That was close to right. So as we get started, I wanted to draw your attention to the mobile number, which you'll find in the on your link, the chat, I believe, on Zoom. That SMS number links to Martin, and as a consequence, if you send your questions, that as you think of them, through the session as I'm interviewing Anthony, then Martin will send them through to me, and hopefully they'll turn up on this piece of technology here. So what I'd like to do now is to kick off, and basically, Anthony, probably ask just a couple of questions to get to know you a little bit better, because as I say, many people will know you from university. So you invested your professional life in and around financial institutions and regulators, both in South Africa and Australia. What attracted you to the actuarial work, and how has it maintained your interest over many years?
The confession to the attraction, I've done maths, economics, and enjoyed both. So that actuarial seemed to be there together. It was clearly attractive because it was difficult. That was, I think, most actuaries, there's some sort of incentive to do, this must be worth doing because it's difficult. And I'd learned enough economics to believe that if it was well paid, it was useful. I sort of subsequently learned that more economics discovered that wasn't necessarily the case. But actually, to turn what I knew into something useful, I think, has been the challenge for most of my career. To create as we talk about the financial, to be an architect of financial security for people. And obviously, it's not developing it from scratch, it's making small changes to it in various ways.
Refining it in its way. So given that range of roles that you've had, what do you think would be the one event or opportunity that you might say that's been fairly pivotal or influential in the rest of your career?
Yeah, that was one of your curved questions. I'm glad I saw it this morning. So in '87, I wrote a paper for the Actuaries Society of South Africa on pension withdrawal benefits. So we had mainly defined benefit pensions at the time. Inflation was about 13%, had been averaging 39%, investment returns 15%. But people who were members of these defined benefit funds, when they left, they got their contributions plus 2.5% interest. And most of them were designed on a 7.5 plus 7.5, make 15. The employer's 7.5 was not given to them when they left. So people, when they left, if you'd been there a couple of years, didn't matter. But there were people in their 40s and 50s who actually would have lost effectively all their retirement savings if they left their jobs. And I was, when I discovered this, I was absolutely outraged. And so I wrote a paper about how we might do something about it. And I knew that a lot of actuaries also found this a bad thing, although many of them said, it's not our job. We just advise trustees and government. It's not right, but we don't just do it anyway. What we could do about it. Anyway, I knew a lot of people were against it. And so I wrote the paper and I proposed a motion at the annual general meeting that followed to suggest that we might define what just meant, what fair meant, and we might set up a way of changing this arrangement. And I got someone to second my motion, but there was absolute no other support at all. And that just struck me. And people said, well, we don't you don't know what justice is. What does it mean? What's fair? There's no such thing. And I thought, no. The motto of the Actuarial Society of South Africa was equitas, meaning justice. So in 1948, actuaries knew that fairness and justice was important. But by 1987, they didn't think it existed. And that was a major change for me to say, well, what's happened here? Why is the profession lost its sense of indignation at unfairness? And so that's governed a good deal of my work going to the university, being at the university at that stage. No, I went to the university a couple of years later. And it took me, and if you read my book, it took 15 years to get the legislation changed. But in 2002, they did some legislation, changed the rules so that that would no longer happen. And interestingly enough, went back to 1980, that any surplus that had been arisen in pension funds as a consequence of these bad benefits should be repaid to the members that left. And about 30 or 40 billion rand, which is a fair amount of money, actually eventually got paid back to us. So it showed, just like, as a South African, that things on that apartheid looked invincible, but could change. And something like this looked impossible to change, but given enough time and enough support, could change. So social change can happen.
Yeah.
And one needs to commit to it.
It's interesting because I guess in Australia at the same time, pension funds or superannuation funds that never really gave lump sums had very similar structures. Your withdrawal benefit was your contributions with 4% interest or something like that. I guess it's only really with the Keating changes and I guess a move away from defined benefit towards defined contribution funds that we've seen a lot of that issue around vesting become taken almost for granted. But again, it's required some sort of change, hasn't it? So you've recently retired from your full-time university role. So what does your joy look like today?
This is another question that he said
Early
on. I thought it was a misprint that it's day rather than joy, but joy rather than day. But okay, what are my joys? So obviously, relationship with my wife, relationship with grandchildren. I mean, the 3-year-old kids are when they're not yearly are wonderful to cover. We have 10 grandchildren and 7, so it's really nice. So
nice to be able to give them back after the visit.
I don't change any longer. I did my fair share. And then we've just spent. You were saying we spent the last week at Ningaloo Reef in Western Australia, and the beauty of nature. I mean, the reef, the gorges, the sunsets. Those definitely, I think, bring joy to us.
Indeed. Thank you for that. So, turning more to superannuation now, it's clearly a major driver of both savings and investment in Australia, particularly since compulsory super came in the 1980s. Now, the Bible doesn't mention anything about superannuation per se. So, why do you think God has any interest in what people might do with their superannuation or in how it's managed?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the problem first faced you in terms of insurance, and I think as a young Christian, and not like young Christians ask, well, should you take insurance? Should you not trust God and let Him sort things out? But that's not biblical.
No.
So there are two things. The one thing that drives that type of view is the verse in James. Pure religion undefiled before God is this, to look after widows and orphans in their distress and keep oneself unstained from the world. So looking after widows and orphans is clearly the driver. And one might think that means that we should be looking for widows and orphans to give money to. But the key actually is that section in Timothy where he talks about widows, where Paul talks about widows in relation to Timothy. And he says, let widows be enrolled if they're over 60, which gives us the retirement age at the time. Interestingly, not changed much over 2,000 years. But the key is the enrollment. So enrollment meant that they were written down. So they would make some sort of primitive spreadsheet which said these are the widows the church is supporting. So they had a pension fund for widows, and there were rules for admission, and presumably they found ways of supporting it. I mean, interestingly enough, when the bit in Acts where it talks about when they set up the deacons, and the deacons were meant to wait at tables, but the translation can actually be work on the tables, which could be not actuarial tables, but tables of people that were provided for. So you need the scriptures. God is not just wanting us to be appropriately motivated to help the poor, but actually wants us to develop the structures to do so. So the structures, God wants those structures, that we need those structures as human beings. That's part of our nature.
The way you explain that then, it actually makes a lot of sense, because the fact was that there was this concern, wasn't there, between the Hebrew widows and the Greek widows, and that whether people were being treated fair between, which makes more sense than, oh, we just need someone to wait.
Yeah.
Interesting. But it seems like Australia and many other Western countries have, looking at needs like widows and orphans, has become a responsibility of governments rather than the church. I guess that's partly, people turn their backs on religion, and also society is emphasising more individuals' responsibility for looking after themselves. Certainly, I guess our current superannuation system suggests. How do you think that's working?
I would rather see it in terms of the nature of human nature and the nature of society is such that you need these institutions, and that the rules of God, in fact, are the ones that society should adopt, and that as we have, in fact, as society has developed, the looking after widows and orphans in a more universal way has developed. And admittedly, only in the last 2 centuries have the funds become more. Well, no, not really. We've had individual groups looking after pensions, but you can trace pension funds back. The Roman army had a pension scheme. The church in the Middle Ages had pension schemes. The poor laws in the UK, I know that's not a debate, so they were the same sort of. So there has to be. There always have been state involvement, and the more universal it is and the fairer it is, the more I think God is pleased with it. We could be pleased with it.
So, okay. Now, there was a Royal Commission recently, there's been a number, and the Hayne Royal Commission into misconduct in banking, superannuation and finance. Only 9 of the 76 recommendations, they're actually dealt directly with superannuation as such. 3 of those related to changes in regulation. So are there any particular issues you see in our superannuation sector that you believe still need to be called out or better addressed?
Yes, I mean, I think the Royal Commission was, in some respects, very limited in its ambit, and relied on self-reported abuses, failure to obey the rules as they stand, especially as are the rules reasonable. So, I mean, certainly at the Actress Institute, which I'm involved in with our strategy group, and we're currently looking at what the institute, the policy institute should have. I mean, certainly there are older people that are financially insecure, and those are those who are renting. You've got your home, you own your own home, the age pension is sufficient, and the super makes it comfortable if you've got some super. If you are not, if you do not, you're in trouble very often. The rental allowance is $2,500 a year, which I don't think, maybe they'll give you a corner of some small caravan park for that, but not much.
Well out.
Well out of the sticks. So that's certainly to call that out. Is there is those that are really financially insecure? It's an issue. There are unfairnesses, but they're a bit on the margin in the sense. I mean, we need to work at the concessions are a bit overly generous for some, and the means tests are involved, to my mind, a lot of us believe that they involve an intrusion in people's lives. They're quite penal, and it's Centrelink is an enemy in a sense. They have got to ask you every year what the market value of your personal effects are. And they will phone you and say, what's your car worth? And that just should affect the value of the wage pension. That's ridiculous.
At the end of the day, you could simplify this so much more by taking out a lot of those things, because presumably most people are going to have that, and as you say, it doesn't actually affect their capacity to be able to live in terms of buying.
So simplifying things is a major question, and that requires quite a lot of work that we need to work on.
So how might people who work in the field of superannuation, like some of the people here today, and obviously online, and also in the financial services sector more generally, view their role more as a vocation than a job? And if they do that, how might that affect the way in which we work?
So vocation, we're having this debate with strategy with the Actuaries Institute. How do you start off with deciding what an organisation is there for, and what your role in it is? And so there is a question of what's the social purpose. The purpose of organisations is clearly not to make a profit, because the Actuaries Institute doesn't make a profit. The purpose of organisations is for a social role. And the role of superannuation and financial services, insurance industry generally, is clearly to provide financial security. And so that the ethics of it, I mean, so you decide what's good or bad in the sense of, can you achieve your role? And what's your social purpose? Now, within that social purpose of the industry as a whole, we each have a personal role to play. It's maybe building the institution, maybe maintaining the institution. And the question that we need to ask ourselves, St. Augustine says at the beginning of adulthood, what do I want to be remembered for? Question to ask. What's my role? Where am I to be? Peter Drucker says, if you can think you can answer the question by the time you're 25, you haven't understood it. But if you can't answer it by the time you're 50, you wasted your life. There's a window in which to work on it. And so the question is, how am I going to make a contribution for me? And that's what God, if you like, God calls us to do. T.S. Eliot says, the good man is the builder if he builds what's good. The good person is the builder if they build what is good. And we make a contribution to our world, our employer, next generations to teach, volunteering to teach students, the profession, the AFSA or whatever you've been involved in.
Yeah. And so, I guess applicable, not obviously just to numbers, but to any role that people might be taking on too. But we can look at I guess our working lives as being part of that motivation. Well, in summary then, what do you think is the relevance of God's view of Australian superannuation to how we would?
One of the things that is, clearly why I got involved in justice in the first place is that the Bible's quite clear that God wants justice, fairness. And I think that's part of his wanting a relationship with us, covenant, if you like, a relationship of where reading, this morning's reading, what I did was, you are my friends if you do what I can do. And we work, so okay, one is we work together with God. We can be friends with God and work with him. If you do what I command you, in a sense, it's not arbitrary. It's not it's not, well, I want you to do these things, and if you don't do them, I'm not really going to be your friend. The question, the commands are the commands that make us good, make us fulfill our purpose. They're the commands for health, for psychological health, if you like, and the virtues, prudence, wisdom, self-control, courage. We develop those to be healthy individuals, and which involve obeying God and learning to love him. And in that relationship, that's the relationship he wants. Now, he's concerned about fairness, I think, because when we deal with other people, so we relate to God, and then the point is that our relationship with other people should be like that relationship with God, that we don't take more than our fair share from them. And that's the question of fairness. Justice is defined as giving people their due, their fair share. The opposite is greed, is taking more than my fair share. And I mean, there's a belief, there's a narrative, belief in business in the world today, that in fact greed motivates people to do things, and if we wouldn't have the economy that we have if we didn't were motivated to take more than our fair share. But that's not psychologically true. That's not confirmed by research. It's not confirmed, I'm sure, by your own experience. In fact, giving gives us more pleasure than taking more than our fair share. There's no reason why financial institutions should be maximizing profit at the expense of their employees or of their customers. They need a fair profit, but that's their fair share. Taking more than your fair share is the problem. What I call shareholder piracy rather than shareholder primacy. So part of what we've got to do, what we've got to be aware of, is that narrative, which is misleading, is to make sure we don't overcharge, that we do give when we're giving, that our contribution to our own organisations are fair. We don't give too much. Some of us are inclined to give too much, to allow ourselves to be exploited or allow other people to be exploited, and that the organisations do not exploit the customers. So the question of overcharging, which is quite prominent, and what's often not realised is over-servicing.
Mm-hmm.
So giving more than is necessary. So trading too much liquidity in the market, providing too many options, that cost a lot of money that really don't offer value. A big issue I found in this retirement incomes working group, where we find companies are against annuities. Why? Because the money will go to, the financial advisors are against it because there's no more commissions, because they're set and forget. And the managers are not, the fund managers are against it because they're more dealing by an underlying asset that's meant to pay the annuity, etc. So that's another servicing question that needs to be addressed, which is difficult in some respects, because it actually says we've got to decline our revenue rather than grow it, because it can be done more efficiently.
I guess that, to some extent, presumably there's the potential in the future that may be addressed by startups and organisations like that and say, hey, we're going to do something differently. But then, of course, I guess the history of these things has been that eventually most of those startups into the same behaviour as the existing organisations after a while.
I had a paper published which I announced on my LinkedIn profile, which we're debating, which I'm doing some comments on this morning. And one comment was, again, this TSD. The world turns, changes, but one thing does not change. One thing does not change: perpetual struggle of good and evil. And so there's always institutions need to be built and to become good, and then there's corruption from greed, and then we try and get rid of the corruption. So there is this long-term, things get worse and things get better. But having said that, coming from a poorer country which has not had sufficient numbers of people building things that are good, I really appreciate the Australian world that we live in, that we are the benefactors, the beneficiaries, of benefactors, of people that have made sacrifices, contributed to the building in the past. All sorts of people, many ways, that have made this society very, the world, the life that we have, very comfortable. And that's, we're either part of that group or part of the greedy and the unhappy.
Well, superannuation is certainly an issue that most people are going to be concerned with and are going to plan for. Are there any other issues that might be even more critical for them considering at any particular time? Given your experience.
Well, it's the mystery of that relationship with God. If they're obeyed, it's love that remains. So when you want to be remembered, whatever you want to be remembered for, whether it's the contribution you've made to organisations or to society, have you loved? Have you participated in this wonderful dance and relationship of game or whatever it is of exchange and of love? That's really the source of joy, fruitfulness, and what makes life worthwhile.
Yeah. Anthony, thank you very much for those insightful comments. We've got a number of questions. The first one that's come in, quote, as you know, first life insurance tables were developed by a Presbyterian minister. It's very appropriate we're in our venue today. Inspired to care for the widows in his congregation. In Australia, the AMP was founded by an active congregationalist, Thomas Holt, to broaden these principles to those beyond the church. How has superannuation lost its way? How much was it due to demutualisation, or what I call dismembering them, the questioner asks? And finally, what should we do about AMP today? Now, I don't necessarily need to talk about that. I'm sure AMP will deal with it, but that raises a number of issues in how superannuation is developed.
I think the first life table was actually a Roman 3rd century, based, I think, on the annuities that were sold at that time.
Right.
But in modern times,
I think,
or pension times, Scottish, yeah.
Yes.
Have we lost our way? Well, in parts. I think there have been improvements. I think it is this question of the narrative. There's this long, what Eliot calls the struggle between good and evil, perhaps putting it a little bit too strongly, but there are two narratives of greed and of service, and the collaboration of individual, the appearance of individual self-sufficiency, which is you've got AMP. I mean, I think we can reflect on it. I mean, AMP, if you look at it, is probably the worst, we've been competition for the worst managed company in the world last 30 years. I mean, it's
value destruction.
It to the value destruction. So, I mean, it's taken a 60% share of the life insurance market and turned it into nothing, which is pretty spectacular. And actuaries were involved in it. And we've got to ask ourselves the question of why that was the case. I think the narrative that was captured in the early 90s, the demutualisation and the importing of some of their managers, led to a culture that was very greedy. They were super profitable and weren't prepared to, their returns on capital on their traditional business probably were sort of over 50%, 80% per annum, and they thought that was their right. So they lost sight of their social function.
Agent remuneration, do you think that contributed to it as well?
I do believe that was part of it. They didn't really deal with the fact that what the social purpose was, and many of those agents, I think, were probably overpaid, having established themselves prior to the shift to the trail commissions. So, I mean, I've written on that. Yeah, so a number of things meant that they really weren't prepared to ask hard questions. And I suppose that one must ask about, those actuaries who worked there. Then why, could they have done something? Did they have the courage? Should they have had the courage to do more than they have? But that obviously applies throughout the industry. And I mean, and I do need to say it because we've a young audience here. One of the debates that I had in my book with my editors was I said, if you're young, don't blow the whistle. It's too costly. You may not understand it. Whistleblowing is very costly. If you're going to do it, make sure that you've got lots of support. Take advice. It's more important for you and I at our age, where we've got much less to lose and a little bit more sense of what can be done, what can't be done, to speak out. Young people, don't lose your idealism and your desire to change things, but you focus until you're 30 at least on developing your skills and being ready to do something different, rather than blow a whistle and turn yourself into an exile and a scapegoat for the.
I mean, obviously, there are certainly positions within financial institutions where there is a responsibility to whistleblow. The Insurance Acts both have clauses in there for the appointed actuary to do certain things, to have access to certain things. And I guess that's where the challenge can often be. What if the appointed actuary is not doing the role that you think they should do? How do you deal with that? I guess there are a number of possibilities. The institute, obviously, that's one of the reasons for having an institute of actuaries, which is separate from employers, even though it's obviously highly dependent on employers in terms of cash flow and things like that for membership. But at the same time, you can approach the CEO and get some counselling or advice on those sorts of areas. Or you can talk to old guys like you or me. Exactly. Another question, there's a lot of attention lately to responsible investment. Do you think God cares about how super assets are invested?
Yes, I'm sure he does. And I think this comes partly to the primacy piracy, and partly also just to long-sightedness. Just what's the long-term consequence of how we invest? And I think, the general idea that we should be looking at more at the long-term consequences and the real risks, I think is fantastic. This, without its hypocrisy and its not all the thinking is as clear as it might be, but I think it's great, and we should work hard at making the thinking as clear as possible. How soon can we free ourselves from carbon? I think there's a great movement.
Now, I'm not excluding the audience here from asking questions. If anyone does have a question, please stick your hand up and I can repeat it so that it's recorded on the and also can be heard by those online. But another question which has come in: inflation is back. Interesting. How should Christians respond? You don't think inflation is back. When it does come back, how do you think we should respond?
Difficult, I think. All right, so a little bit of inflation is what clearly is wanted, and I'm too much could be a problem, and I'm not sure that I think house price inflation, asset price inflation is not a great thing. So there's a fair amount of greed underlying. We obviously can't do something about the economy wide, but we are responsible for what we ourselves do. And I've thought for some time what's the proximate cause of inflation? Not the money supply is growth. That doesn't how it works through to inflation. What's the proximate? What causes prices to go up? People put their prices up. I mean, if people don't put their prices up, it wouldn't happen. Why do you put your price up? Because your costs have gone up and you want to maintain your profit margin. So it's I think and clearly the bout in the 70s happened because there was this fight between unionized workers and companies to keep what they regard as their fair share, and they just squabbled over it. So I think Japan's got not Christian, but got a much better understanding of greed, didn't face the same level of inflation because they didn't feel that they put their prices up to maintain their profits. So I think we could talk about let's talk about not trying to exploit inflation to increase our profit shares, but to understand what the underlying causes are and try to address those to the extent they exist.
Although Japan did suffer some fairly high asset inflation at one stage.
It did, yes, they did.
Yeah, that's Andy, during 2020, people were allowed to withdraw, up to $20,000 from the super. We've seen calls prior to this budget. I'm sure we'll see them again afterwards. People should be allowed to access superannuation for home deposits, things like that, on the grounds of improving people's current quality of life, rather than necessarily by worrying about deferring it to an uncertain time in the future. How can a Christian worldview help Australian society address social issues like that?
I think what I've come to be convinced of in the retirement strategy group is that what we want in inflation, what we want is to give people dignity in retirement, dignity in terms of their dealing with super. I think the ability to take money out if you're in if you have a short-term need is actually giving people dignity and the right to choose. What is missing is and perhaps I should have raised this earlier, is the question of enough advice to know whether in fact it's better to take the money now or later. In fact, whether your need now is going to be bigger. And that is one of the issues that I'm having to I am working on at the moment, which is to try and provide cheaper advice. What I would like to see is effectively the ATO or government to provide the data to provide good advice. And then so people would be saying, okay, well, if I take this money out, this is what my long-term consequence will be. Yes, it's worthwhile, or no, it's not. And I think to be given the choice without the advice is unfair. It doesn't actually add to dignity.
And will almost certainly end up with challenges. We've got time for 2 more questions. Over here.
Hi, I'm Alexis Chang. I'm a responsible investment consultant at Mercer. And I'm also a woman and a mother of 2 kids. And statistically, figures show that on average, women retire with 42% less super than men. And 1 in 4 reaches the end of their working lives with the super balance of 0. And particularly within the church, that's true for women. Women often give up their career to care for children or to serve in their local parish and related organizations. So from your perspective in history and super, what can be done to make super more fair for women in Australia, especially for women in ministry or in the church?
So Alexis' question was about fairness. How can we make superannuation fairer for women in society generally, and particularly those in the church?
So from my perspective, I think the driver of it, as you said, is that women very often choose within the family end up with lower incomes, and so they end up with lower super. So it seems to me that the actual issues actually need to be solved within the family, so that if it is decided that the women should earn a lower income, I think it'd be right for super balances to be rehashed. I mean, equalized. I mean, my wife has more super than I have because I made the transfers and we put extra money into her account to do that. I think that's appropriate. That's my belief. So there are the issues relate, I think, to partly the problem that occurs in divorce. So one of the Actuaries Institute policy things is going to supporting other people to make sure that courts have the super balances at their disposal. In fact, what we'd like to see is all asset balances at their disposal when they make divorce settlements. The second thing is, I would like to see women actually have the right to decide on lump sum withdrawals from their husbands or spouses, to have the right to make sure that the spouse is not spending their super, and that at retirement they should one of the reasons for having annuities and appropriate advice at that point is that both members of the couple should be adequately, fairly looked after. So, my wife and my daughters-in-law are taking time out of the workforce to raise children, which I think is appropriate, but they should not. As a consequence, they should not end up in poverty in old age. There definitely need to be institutional structures to make sure that the husband does not go off with the money or spend the money before his spouse dies. So that's the way I'm seeing it. I don't think we need to have men and women absolutely equal without appropriately considering the family structure that has led to this inequality. I mean, you may have different views on that. We could perhaps debate it.
It's an interesting debate, and I guess that there are lots and lots of things which we continue to need to develop, and I guess that's one of the important aspects of getting involved, with the Actuaries Institute, being able to do the sort of research that you've done, and being able to help apply that in policy area as well.
I mean, I will say apparently about 10% of that gap is due to the fact that women and men get paid differently for similar jobs. And that definitely is unfair and needs to be addressed.
One final question. You've done work with Jubilee Centre. Would you recommend their work to us? Jubilee Centre is a UK-based
So that's Michael.
yes.
Anyway, it's Cambridge-based, but
That's
to distinguish from other Jubilee centres,
Yes,
which I could recommend as well. Yeah, there's some interesting stuff on relationship. So
yeah, they've done a lot of work on
there's some Ian Hoffman and whatnot got some work on that. So yeah, that's certainly worth looking at. Yes.
Anthony, thank you very much for your contribution here this afternoon. You've raised a number of questions, and I'm sure that if people would like to follow up afterwards, you can certainly get in contact with Martin if you don't have Anthony's direct contact details, and we can pass it on. I'll ask the audience here to join me in thanking Anthony. As we're wrapping up, I just wanted to make one announcement. The City Bible Forum has another activity which it runs called The Edge. Those of you who are here, there's a piece of paper on your table and on your chair, I should say, and you'll find a link to this online. But on the 27th of May, Thursday night, there's a TED-style talk which is being run out of Perth, and it's going to be on the topic of rethinking workplace relations. And so that'll be from 6 p.m. Perth time, which of course is 8 p.m. here or 7:30 in South Australia, run for about an hour. They have two speakers who will be on speaking briefly for about 15 minutes each, and then I believe there's Q&A. Jill McAlpine, who's a clinical, he said, trying to change his page over, psychologist, and Simon Bibby, who's an employee relations executive. And they're going to share some of their key insights on some of the relational challenges in the employment space, workplaces such as bullying, sexism, and racism. And I guess they're obviously all topics which are, quite current, throughout the country at the moment. Certainly something I hope which, as Christians, we can help to address. Now, finally, there is another piece of paper on your chairs, and also again in the chat room, some feedback. And if I take, so that was for The Edge. The second piece of paper, which basically just gives us the opportunity to get your feedback on today's session. And those of you online, if you could likewise fill that in. I'll give you about a minute now to do that. Pleased to see people feverishly scribbling, which is excellent. That's right, exactly. Great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for taking your time on a Friday afternoon to join us here. I trust that everyone has found this to be exciting and interesting stuff, to be able to sit back and reflect a little bit on our roles as actuaries in the superannuation area, as potential users and eventually beneficiaries of superannuation. Anthony, on behalf of everyone, I'd just like to once again thank you very much for your contribution this afternoon, and I hope that people will be able to take this and build on it in their own thinking as well. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Of course, I am a beneficiary of superannuation. And you can find me on LinkedIn or my UNSW website.
Still
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.